All right, with about 6 minutes left. We are recording. Morning. Right, so Savannah is here, and Lucas is here.
Watson, right? Good. Morning.
Morning.
Edwards. Bartoli, right? See. Shaper is here. Shazam is here. Noah is here. I know I just said everybody's name, but I'll do it one more time for the recording. Ashley is not here, right? Okay, no Ashley. Eric is here. Wooten is not here. Strahan is here. Dickens, not here. Clark is not here. Inca is not here. Isaiah is here. Smith is not here. Watson is here. Kaylee is here. Lucas is here. Marley is here. Noah is here. Savannah is here. Mia is here. Edwards is here, and Wilkes is not here. Did I miss anybody? All right. Jump into it. Happy hump day. There. All right. So as usual, I just want to remind you that you can retake exam 1 until exam 2 is ready. And I'm still not sure when exam 2 is going to be due. Exam 2, we're about to start the last chapter for exam 2. Last thing we're going to cover for exam 2 is photosynthesis. That's where we start today. And according to WVSU Online, exam 2 is not even due until like April. So I think that might be a glitch. I'm going to adjust it. I'll let you know when the time is. I also welcome your input. As we get closer to the end of this chapter, I'll probably ask you guys, when you send your attendance words, to also vote on when you think you'd like to take it. Because, you want time to study it, but at the same time, if you have too much time, and you run a new material, then you kind of forget the old material. So we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But anyway, yes, you can retake exam 1 up until the day exam 2 is due. And then after that, you can meet in line to get all the correct answers and a 5% boost to your grade. Again, there's nothing to lose for retaking exams. The highest grade is the one you would keep. Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Or email me, I guess. Lab 7, just to remind you, that is due Friday. So this is going to be on mitosis and meiosis, which we haven't started yet. We'll start that probably, maybe this week. But this particular pre-lab involves 2 sets of video questions and 1 set of introduction questions. In this case, there are no hypothesis questions, so it'll be a little bit easier for you. Any questions about the pre-lab that's due on Friday? All right, lab 6 is due today. You're going to need pants and closed-toed shoes. Make sure you're not late. If you don't have pants and closed-toed shoes right now, if you can text somebody to see if they can help you, you might want to do that because you can't be in here if you don't have pants and closed-toed shoes. Any questions about today's lab? Okay. And attendance, as usual, right? Attendance is mandatory. Participation is graded to get your points today. When we're done, you need to send a list of attendance words, screenshots for every time I say your attendance word. If you're watching the video, so you guys obviously can't make screenshots. Well, I guess you could, but there's no need to if you're here. And then the part that people seem to forget often, 1 question about the material covered from the lecture. So again, even if you understood everything, or you think you understood everything, just don't think of it like you're asking me a question like you don't understand. If you understood everything, send me a question as if you're helping me out. Like, hey, here's a question that you could use on the exam. All right. So that being said, first word for attendance is going to be pants. Pants is the first word for attendance. So if you came in late, make sure you include that fact that you came in late on your email. Otherwise, when I go back to the points, I'll say, wait a minute. When I took attendance, you weren't here. Anyway, here's the first word for attendance. Any questions about anything? Again, the full list of words and one question about the material covered. Let's jump into it. Here we go. We're talking about photosynthesis. I think I mentioned this before when we were talking about respiration. I said if I wrote the textbook, I would do photosynthesis and then respiration. Because when you put the two together, we're talking about one huge picture. I'm going to talk about the huge picture before we get into these details. What we're talking about is getting energy from the sun into your cells as ATP, right? This whole thing is just one long story about getting that sun energy converted to in different ways until you can have ATP in your cells. And as you're going to learn today, when we talk about photosynthesis, we're going to take that energy from the sun and we're going to use it to make high energy electrons. That should sound familiar, right? We've been talking about a lot about that with respiration. We're going to use those high energy electrons and incorporate them into glucose. That's photosynthesis in a nutshell. Obviously, we're going to learn a lot more detail, but in a nutshell, that's what we're doing, right? We're using the sun energy to excite electrons and incorporate them into a molecule of glucose. That's photosynthesis. Then, with all the stuff we just finished, right, we're going to take that glucose, and then in respiration, we're going to break it down to release those high energy electrons. And then we're going to use those high energy electrons to produce ATP. So that's the big story. That's pretty much the whole exam, too, in one short statement. Actually, exam 2 also does include a little bit of things about like hypertonic and isotonic and those things, and some things about how the enzymes work and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's going to be about photosynthesis and respiration. Whoops. So this PowerPoint, how did I do that? Somehow I went all the way to the end. All right, bear with me. Anyway, this PowerPoint, like a lot of the other ones, is based on the old textbook. I've made some changes to it. Here we go. Here's where we were. All right. So this introduction too is also based on the old textbook. The old textbook at the beginning of every chapter had a little section that says, hey, why does this matter to your everyday life? Like obviously you need to know it for this class, but why does it matter for your everyday life? You can read that if you want, but I'm not going to get into it. I will point this out because all of this pretty much probably makes sense, right? Photosynthesis, obviously we're going to be talking about photosynthetic organisms like plants in the sun. So hence that picture. Speaking of plants, that's a picture of somebody planting something. And the old textbook was getting at the fact that plants absorb carbon dioxide. That's one of the things they need for photosynthesis. And your textbook talks about how that's good for the environment. And that one's a little bit less intuitive. What's that have to do with photosynthesis, right? This is somebody rubbing sunblock on their skin, and they're doing that to protect themselves from UV light. So in this chapter, there's a few things you're going to learn. Like, for example, you're going to learn about the nature of sunlight. So you're going to learn exactly what UV light is and why it's harmful as compared to the light that we see. Also, you're going to learn that we put on sunblock, but also you're going to learn that plants also have their own version of sunblock. So anyway, let's jump into it. Here's the 3 main points. Again, this PowerPoint, more so than any of the other ones, was really based off of the old textbook. Because the old textbook, in my opinion, did a much better job. So things you're going to be learning in here are going to be slightly out of order from the way they're presented in the textbook. You can see here, for example, I almost always have like 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. In this case, I'm not doing this because, again, the old textbook just does such a better job with presenting photosynthesis. So that's what I'm sticking with. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the basics of photosynthesis. And before we even get into how it works, you're going to get a little bit of background information. For example, you probably already know that photosynthesis happens in chloroplasts. So we're going to learn a little bit more about chloroplasts. And then, before we actually get into the 2 stages of photosynthesis, just like last chapter, before we get into the details, we're going to look at the big picture, right? We're going to look at an overview, and then we'll get into the details. So are there any questions so far? All right. Photosynthesis. This is used by photoautotrophs. I was just looking at exam 2 where there's a question about that. So you need to know what uses photosynthesis. And you probably, everybody, for the most part, knows that plants use photosynthesis, but also don't forget about algae and certain bacteria. The trickier question, even though we've already passed this chapter, I just want to remind you. One of the questions is going to say something like, which of these uses cellular respiration? And the answer, and I'm going to keep things easy for that, your choices are either plants, animals, both, or none. And the answer is both, right? Everybody get so focused on photosynthesis when they think about plants that they forget that they're also doing cellular respiration. And that's going to be important for the experiments that we'll be doing today. So, for example, if you're studying respiration, and a lot of you had some great hypotheses, like, yeah, respiration does not require light. Actually, some of you lost points for that because you said respiration does require light, and it doesn't. But anyway, that's something to keep in mind too, is like these things are going to be doing respiration, but there's fuel for respiration that we just talked about in the last chapter, right? Which is glucose. And where does glucose come from? It comes from photosynthesis. So there should be a point. I don't know if it's going to be within this 45 minutes of our experiments, but there should be a point where it runs out of glucose, right? And it runs out of oxygen because that's what it's using. And without photosynthesis, it does not have glucose and oxygen. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So any questions about what uses photosynthesis? All right. In a nutshell, this is what photosynthesis does. It transforms light energy into chemical energy. That might be a test question. And as a matter of fact, you should definitely memorize that before you memorize anything else. Like all the other details, who cares? If you can't remember that fact, then what's it matter if you remember which stage uses this and which stage produces that? That's useless. The most important, well, it's not useless, but it's a lot less useful than just the big picture, which is that photosynthesis transforms light energy into chemical energy. This part you don't need to know, but it was included in the old textbook and maybe even your textbook, so I included it. But we use this chemical energy to produce food, and to produce clothing, to produce wood, produce energy, right? So coal, for example, we use coal here in our neck of the woods to produce electric energy, and that coal is chemical energy. They came from photosynthesis millions of years ago. So, are there any questions about this slide? All right, so again, photosynthesis is used by photoautotrophs. Here's some pictures of some photoautotrophs from the old textbook. Plants on the left, photosynthetic protists in the middle, specifically kelp, and then some photosynthetic bacteria. So basically, if it has chloroplast or chlorophyll, it does photosynthesis. I will point this out, just for your own knowledge. These two things on the left, plants and protists, those are eukaryotes, meaning their cells have organelles, specifically the chloroplast that we're about to talk about. Now, what we're not going to talk about, and you can look into for extra credit if you want, is this situation, bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. Bacteria do not have organelles. Therefore, they don't have chloroplast because chloroplasts are not organelles. So everything I'm about to teach you about how photosynthesis works by using these chloroplasts does not apply to bacteria because they don't have chloroplasts. So you can look into it if you want for extra credit. Any questions about this slide? Okay, so again, like I said, this happens in chloroplasts. So let's jump into it and talk about chloroplasts. First of all, this will be a test question, and at least one person will miss it. I've never had a semester where someone didn't miss it, and it makes me sad because I feel like this is one of the easiest questions. So there will be a few really easy questions that can compare and contrast respiration versus photosynthesis. And one of them says, blank happens in the chloroplast and blank happens in mitochondria. So photosynthesis happens in chloroplasts, and respiration, which we finished talking about in the last chapter, that happens in mitochondria. It should be very easy. Someone will miss it. I'm hoping the people who have always missed it every semester, it's just like maybe they clicked the wrong button or had a brain fart. I hope. But yes, this is where it happens. So let's talk about chloroplasts. Like I said, this is the site of photosynthesis. It's basically a light-absorbing organelle because, again, like I said, the big picture here is we're taking sun energy and we're using that energy and converting it into chemical energy. This is where it happens, right? If we're going to do that, we need something to absorb that energy. What you don't need to know is this third bullet point, but I included it anyway because the textbooks did too. Usually the chloroplasts are found on the interior cells of leaves. I put a little star next to that to remind myself to tell you. Oh yeah, all green parking trees have them and photosynthesized, but the leaves have about 300 million in a piece of leaf about the size of a nickel. So we say this because leaves have far more chloroplasts than any of the other green parts. But just for your own knowledge, if it's green on a plant, for the most part, it does have chloroplasts, and it does do photosynthesis. But for the most part, it's happening in the interior cells. We'll talk a little bit more about chloroplasts moving forward. We'll talk about their structure, their function, and the different parts. But for now, are there any questions about chloroplasts, about what you have so far? Okay, another word you probably heard before is chlorophyll. Does anybody know what would you say chlorophyll is? Again, I always ask you the same way. If a kindergartner asked you what chlorophyll was, how would you answer? But some of you are early ed majors, so this is really directed towards almost anybody can answer it. You should be, if you're an early ed major, you should kind of start thinking about how you would explain things to kindergartners and start getting the bravery, I guess, whatever, to talk in public. So does anybody want to answer that question? How would you explain that? What is a chlorophyll? Or what is chlorophyll? How would you explain it to a kindergartner? For extra points, your participation points today, someone volunteer to answer that, because we have a little bit of time. Like I said, I'm on day one. I don't want to talk to you. I'd rather talk with you. Like I said recently, I love wrong answers. If I know where your brain's at, I can help take you from your wrong answer to the right answer. If I don't know where you're at, I can't take you there. So someone tell me, how would you explain it? What is chlorophyll? How would you explain it to a kindergarten? I'll wait a little longer. I don't mind. We'll just have an awkward silence. I had what was that class? Ecology. I had a professor in ecology. I may have mentioned this before this semester, but he used to do that for everything he'd say. He'd be like, chloroplast. It's a site of photosynthesis. And he would just do that and sit there and look at you like, okay, so we're gonna move on. But I'm telling you, I'm not moving on. Someone tell me, what is chlorophyll? How would you explain it to a kindergartner? Not even for extra points. Yeah, there we go. The non-teacher major too, right? You're not an education major. All right. What's your take on chlorophyll? Yes, it is what makes plants green. That would actually be the best probably answer to kindergarten. Not what I was going for, but now that you mentioned it, that would probably be better. Anything beyond that would probably confuse them. Yes, chlorophyll is green. Is what makes plants green. Technically, we call that a pigment. What is a pigment? A pigment is a light-absorbing molecule. So Isaiah, when you send in your participation words, remind me that you answered that. Anyway, chlorophyll plays a central role in converting solar energy to chemical energy, and you'll see why and how later as we move forward in this chapter. You're going to learn a little bit more science about light itself. And then once you know that, you're going to learn a little bit of science about pigments. And as you might imagine, it has a lot to do with electrons. Remember from the last chapter, we keep talking about high energy electrons. Well, this is where it comes from. And again, we're going to come back and talk about chloroplasts in more detail, and we're going to talk about chlorophyll in more detail. Right now, this is just an introduction, the big picture before we dive into greater details. Are there any questions about this slide before we move forward? Okay. The next word for attendance is going to be exits. And I've circled it just in case it's hard for you to hear me. I know I've had that. It's hard for you to hear on the video, so there's nothing I can do about that. I apologize. Anyway, there's another term you might need to know. I might ask you this term, but more than likely I'll at least use it. So if you don't know what it means, then you won't know what I'm saying when I use it. The term is called stomata. These are tiny pores in leaves. This is where carbon dioxide enters and oxygen exits. In a weird way, you could almost think of it as the mouth of a plant, of the leaves, right? Because this is where they're breathing, so to speak. This is where they're exchanging gas. And I say so to speak because at least one of you, for your hypotheses when we talked about plants, you talked about plants breathing. But to be clear, just so you know, plants don't technically breathe. They do exchange gases, but breathing requires lungs. But anyway, if you're thinking about it as breathing, then you can think about the stomata as mouths. Has anybody ever heard the term stigmata? That has nothing to do with biology. So stigmata is like a religious thing where people just they claim they just like woke up with holes in their hands, like Jesus had, was probably in the wrist, not the hands. But anyway, I don't know, for some reason when I was a student, that's always how I remember what stomata was, because stomata is a hole in the leaves, and it sounded a lot like stigmata, which is a hole in somebody's limbs. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more detail about the chloroplast. So here's some parts, and this is going to make more sense when I show you a picture starting on the next slide. There's these things called thylakoids. These are the membranes in the chloroplast where a lot of these reactions happen that I'm going to teach you about. Now, I'm not really sure if I'm going to use that term thylakoid or not on the exam. I don't remember if it is. And also, I don't know if I'm going to have time to go in there. I like to edit the exams every semester, but I don't always get to it. So anyway, I don't know if thylakoids is going to be used in the exam or not, but I'm definitely not going to ask you what a thylakoid is. But as you read the textbook and as we move forward in this PowerPoint, I will use the term thylakoid. So that's why you need to know what it is, right? The thylakoid, again, it's the membrane in the chloroplast where a lot of these reactions occur. It's a double membrane. Again, I'm not going to ask you a question about that. But to understand how this process works, that's important for you to know too. Just like when we talk about respiration. The fact that the mitochondria was double membrane turned out to be not trivial at all, remember? Because those hydrogen ions that were getting pumped against their concentration gradient were stuck between the outer membrane and the inner membrane, and they had nowhere to go. And they were getting highly concentrated, right? So because of that, they just diffused back down the concentration gradient. And that's where we made all the ATP, was because that happened. So again, the fact that this is double membrane is not trivial. Might not be on the exam, but it's not trivial. Any questions about this slide before we look at some visuals? All right, here's some visuals from the old textbook. So if you happen to find this easier to learn and study than the one you're using, then you should study the PowerPoints in addition to your textbook. Here we go. We're looking at this cell. Excuse me, this leaf, right? This little square is where we're zooming in. We're zooming into this square of the leaf. And we have a drawing instead of a picture. That's an actual picture. Here's the drawing. What we can see here is the outside of the cell, the outside of the leaf at the top, outside at the bottom, and then the interior, right? Like we said, that's where all the chloroplasts are, or most of the chloroplasts. We have the vein that we don't even talk about at all in this chapter or this semester. But it is there. That's what carries. Obviously, when you think of vein, you might think of humans where you're carrying blood, but in this case, it's not blood, obviously. It's carrying water and nutrients. And then, of course, the stuff we've already talked about, the stomata, right? These holes in the bottom of the leaf where it's exchanging, right? Carbon dioxide in, oxygen out. So any questions so far before we zoom in even more? All right. So again, each one of these little things is a cell, and you can see they're kind of polka dotted with the green dots. Those little green dots are the chloroplast. We're going to zoom in now to one cell. So there we go. And this is an actual microscope picture of one cell, and each one of those green dots is a chloroplast. Now we'll zoom in a little further. Well, yeah, zoom in with a drawing and a picture. So here's an actual picture from a microscope of what a thylakoid looks like. So there we go. When you have like one chloroplast right here, you can see here that we have thylakoids, just a bunch of thylakoids inside that one double membrane chloroplast. The stuff inside of it, that's called the stroma. It's a word I probably won't use, but when you're studying your textbook, as I'm sure you do very often, you'll know what that means when you read it. Stroma, it's just the space, basically, on the inside of the chloroplast, which is slightly different than the thylakoid space, right? Because that's the space inside the thylakoid. Now, technically, when you have thylakoids stacked up on each other, that is called a granum. So again, those are mostly words I'm not going to use. I might use thylakoid, but for the most part, I'm not going to use any of those other words again. But when you're studying this in your textbook, again, I wanted to be able to at least introduce you to these terms so you know what they mean. So any questions about this slide before we have an overview of photosynthesis, big picture stuff? Okay, so before we get to the overview, let's address the exam. When we talked about respiration, like I told you, a majority of the exam when it comes to photosynthesis, respiration will be, in which stage does this happen? In which stage does that happen? In which stage is this used? In which stage is this produced? The same is going to be true of photosynthesis. So as I'm going through all this, keep in mind, that's mostly how the questions are going to go. Also keep in mind, as you can see here, it's a little bit easier in a sense. Photosynthesis is a little bit easier than respiration because there's only two stages. There's light reactions and there's the Calvin cycle. Respiration has three. So that being said, I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to remind you this a few times, people are still going to miss it. When you get questions about photosynthesis on this multiple choice exam, there's going to be two correct answers, either light reactions or Calvin cycle, and then there's going to be junk to distract you. And as long as you guess one of these two, you'll at least get partial credit even if you're wrong. But if you guess any of the junk, you're going to get 0 credit. For example, I might say, in which two stages is carbon dioxide used? And I would say, the correct answer is Calvin cycle. But then you might have an option that says something like, I don't know, glycolysis, which we know is respiration, or mitosis, which is something you're not even going to learn until the next chapter. So again, when you get to this exam and you're answering questions about photosynthesis, these are the only options: light reactions or Calvin cycle. The rest of there is just there to distract you, and it will hurt you, score you more if you don't at least choose one of these two options. Anyway, big picture, photosynthesis here. Overall equation. Before I even get into it, I can just tell you a lot of what you're about to learn is simply the opposite of what happens in respiration. Keep that in mind too. In a perfect world, I would have like an exam after every chapter, and then I would make sure you understood that chapter before we went on to the next chapter. Because then the way I suggest learning this, hopefully you're really good with respiration already, but it's better, in my opinion, to know respiration before you start learning photosynthesis, because then again, you can just kind of just think in your head how it's just the opposite of what you just learned. But anyway, that being said, right, so respiration, the equation for respiration that you just learned was oxygen plus glucose gives you water and carbon dioxide. Here it's the opposite. Here we use carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose and oxygen. And remember too, in respiration, that was a process where we were releasing energy, right? We're breaking down that glucose to release energy. In this situation, we're not necessarily releasing energy, but we need energy, right? Because we're trying to build this high energy molecule of glucose. So to build that molecule, like you learned earlier, however much energy it takes to build something, it's how much energy is going to be released when you build it. We need energy to build it, and that's where the light comes in. So again, this is just the opposite of respiration. And that might be that's one of those other basic compare and contrast questions, the big picture stuff that I get pretty sad when people miss, right? A lot of them's like, well, which one of these has this chemical equation, photosynthesis or respiration? I don't know. I think one of the easy ways to remember it, even though saying the respiration is different than respiration, like breathing, but in one way it's the same. Well, there's a few ways, but one of the ways it's the same is you require oxygen when you breathe, right? So if you can remember that you need oxygen, that's why you're breathing. But hopefully that can help you remember that oxygen is the reactant in respiration. And if you can remember that, then you can remember this is just the opposite. So are there any questions so far? We're going to get deeper into this, but that's it so far. Okay. So as a reminder, the stuff we just finished talking about, the cellular respiration, we can consider that just a gigantic fall of electrons, right? We had these high energy electrons. They were very high energy in the glucose, and they kind of went step, releasing that energy until finally it was accepted by oxygen, which formed water, right? And in the process of those electrons going from place to place to place and releasing that energy, we use that energy to make ATP. And also in the process of breaking down that glucose to get those high energy electrons, we produced carbon dioxide, right? That's what we learned about in the last chapter. So again, photosynthesis is the opposite. Here, we don't have high energy electrons, we just have regular old electrons. So we need to turn them into high energy electrons. We can boost them uphill, so to speak. In photosynthesis, it's water that gives up the electrons, which happens to form a molecule of glucose, oxygen. And then we get those electrons, that we got from water, that we excited, and we incorporate that into glucose. So like I said, in respiration, there's this story of the electrons. Where do they come from? Where do they go? Same thing in photosynthesis, except now it's the opposite. The electrons come from water, which happens to produce a molecule of oxygen, and then they are eventually incorporated into a molecule of glucose. You'll have 2 questions on the exam based on what we have on this slide. And that's going to be a drag and drop question. Like one will say something like, in respiration, electrons come from blank, and you need to know glucose, and they are accepted by blank, which is oxygen, and then which forms a molecule of blank. The answer is water. And again, the opposite will be here, and that's you'll have a similar question. In photosynthesis, electrons come from water, which produces a molecule of oxygen, and then eventually those electrons are incorporated into a molecule of glucose. Again, this requires energy to boost these electrons, to energize them. And obviously, too, if we're going to make glucose, which is C6H12O6, right, 6 carbons, we're going to need some carbon. Where do we get the carbon? We get it from carbon dioxide. So any questions about this slide before I give you a slide from the last chapter to remind you of this main bullet point right here? Okay, so again, this is from the last chapter. This is with respiration. These high energy electrons are stripped away from glucose. They're taken to the electron transport chain. When they release their energy, they're accepted by a molecule of oxygen, which makes a molecule of water. In the process, we produce some ATP. For photosynthesis, it would look the opposite, right? The arrows would just go the other way. We have these low energy electrons. They get boosted, and in the process, you produce oxygen. And eventually, those high energy electrons are incorporated into glucose. So here we go. Again, big picture here. There's 2 stages in photosynthesis that you're going to need to know about: light reactions and chemical cycle. Like I said just a few minutes ago, most of the exam for these 2 is going to be in which stage does this happen, in which stage does that happen, in which stage is this used, in which stage is this produced. So with that in the back of your mind, here we go. Light reactions. They use chlorophyll. You will need to know that for the exam. That should already be obvious today because we already talked, even though we didn't dig deep into it yet, we did talk about chlorophyll. You know it's a pigment, and you know pigment is something that absorbs light energy. Therefore, by the name, hopefully you could have already figured that out, right? Had I asked before I clicked on it, hopefully someone could have figured out, oh, chlorophyll? Yeah, that must be used in the light reactions because chlorophyll is a pigment. Pigments deal with light. What you're going to need to learn about later, and you can write it down now if you want, but there's no need because I think it'll make more sense later. We're going to talk about this in more detail, but again, big picture, this chlorophyll absorbs the light energy, and it does that. It converts that light energy to chemical energy, specifically ATP and NADPH. It should be slightly interesting to you if you've never studied this before, because remember, that was like the end goal of respiration was to make ATP. Yet here we are back talking about ATP again. And it's also something to consider if you think about it for extra credit if you want to look into it. So again, plants do photosynthesis and respiration, right? So they use photosynthesis to make glucose. And then, just like we do, they break down that glucose to make ATP. So the question you might want to you could look into if you want to, is why not just use this process to make the ATP? Why even have to go through all this rigmarole of making the glucose? Why not just make that ATP and use it directly? You can look into that if you want to for extra credit. Another thing you should know, again, this is a big picture. I'm trying to teach you how you can memorize this stuff. Water is used in light reactions. That'll definitely be a test question. Which of the two stages uses water? Light reactions. And hopefully if you can remember, again, this should be easier for you later when we dig deeper into it. But hopefully that makes sense because again, we're trying to get high energy electrons. Actually, let me take a step back. That's I forgot to mention this. That's a new word for you. I mean, I haven't said it yet, but does anybody know what that thing does? I gave you a hint in the last chapter. NADPH, a word that I've never presented to you, or a molecule I've never presented to you. Any guesses what that thing does? I'll get even more specific with the question, narrow it down. Any guesses what NADPH carries for extra participation points? Good, but it is energy, but in what form? And I gave you a hint. I said when I taught you about FADH, NADH and FADH2, I said there's going to be molecules that look just like this, and no matter whether you're talking about photosynthesis or respiration, you could consider that they do the same thing. FADH2 and NADH, they do the same thing as NADPH. No guesses? All right, they carry electrons. You need to know that for the exam. And again, I'm not going to get specific and say, you know, which one of these uses NADPH versus FADH2 versus NADH. Did I say that one already? Anyway, you won't need to know the difference between the three, but like I said in the last chapter, whenever you see anything that looks like this in your brain, you should think, ah, yeah, that thing's carrying electrons from one place to another. Same story, slightly different molecule. But as far as we're concerned, even though they have different names, they are the same molecule. Anyway, back to this idea of electrons. Obviously, if we're using light, obviously the light reactions are using light, and as you're going to learn in more detail later, that light is used to excite electrons. So if you can remember that, and then if you can remember that water is the thing that's providing the electrons, then you can remember for the test question, which of the two stages uses water? Light reactions, right? Hopefully that should all make sense. That the sun is exciting electrons, so we can produce an NADPH. And that would make sense that the electrons, that's where the water's coming in, because that's where the electrons come from. Likewise, another test question is going to be, which of the two stages produces oxygen? And again, if you can remember that when water produces releases those electrons, it produces oxygen. There you go. Now you have a way to answer that question too, a way to memorize that answer. There's a lot of test questions right there, right? Which of the two stages uses chlorophyll? Which of the two stages converts chemical light energy into chemical energy? Which of the two stages produces ATP? Not uses, but produces ATP, light reactions. Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons in the form of NADPH, light reactions? Which of the two stages uses water, light reactions? And then finally, which of the two stages produces oxygen, light reactions? There we go. We just covered half the exam for photosynthesis already. That being said, and I'm not going to waste your time asking you this, even though I want to, because like I said, I'd rather talk with you than talk at you. But since I've said all this, by process of elimination, you should be able to answer the next questions. Like, which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? Well, we haven't talked about that yet, so let's read Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses ATP? Well, if that one produced it, that one must use it. Which of the two stages uses NADPH? Calvin cycle. But anyway, before we get into the Calvin cycle, another big picture way to look at things is you can think of a chloroplast as a factory. This factory makes glucose. And there's two parts to this factory. All factories need energy, right? So you can just think of the light reactions like the power plant. It's the power plant of this situation. But then the Calvin cycle is the thing that's actually going to make what we're after, which is glucose. So that big picture in mind. Again, Calvin cycle uses the products of light reactions, right? So it's using those high energy electrons from the NADPH. It's using that ATP. And it's also using carbon dioxide, which is not a product of light reaction, but it is using carbon dioxide to squish them together, right? And then it needs energy to squish them together. Where does it get the energy? It gets it from ATP. And when it does that, it's incorporating these high energy electrons from the previous cycle to make glucose. So again, Calvin cycle is the thing that's making the glucose. It's trying to kick me off. I'm glad I heard it this time. Nothing worse than going through a whole lecture to find out it didn't record. All right, so any questions about the big picture thing here before I show you an illustration of the big picture? We haven't gotten into details yet. All right, big picture stuff here. So here's the chloroplast. Here we have thylakoid, right? So what's happening here is there's chlorophyll in there. There's electrons that get excited. Those electrons came from the water, which produced oxygen. It's the light that's exciting those electrons. So we use those excited electrons to produce ATP, and we'll talk about how. And you'll see it's not much different than respiration. And we use those, we kind of strip away. No, we don't really strip them away in this case. But anyway, we get those high energy electrons, right? Those electrons that were excited by light. And we capture them with the NADPH and take them somewhere else. Specifically to what we've already talked about, which is the Calvin cycle. So again, the Calvin cycle uses the ATP, right? And it uses that energy to squish a bunch of carbons together to form glucose, right? And in doing that, it's incorporating these high energy electrons into that molecule. And of course, technically, if it uses ATP, obviously that's going to produce an ADP in a phosphate group, right? And technically, if it uses NADPH, right, it's taking away those electrons. Technically, that's going to produce NADPH. Excuse me, NADP plus, which is the thing that's now ready to get those electrons, the electron carrier. Any questions about that big picture? Okay, if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this. It's a little animation. You can see here, there's a chloroplast. You can see some, what's that, carbon dioxide right there. But anyway, this just shows the whole thing animated. It's worth watching, I think. You have to download the PowerPoint and watch it. All right, here's something I'm not going to teach you, or excuse me, I'm not going to ask you about. It is important for life, but for this 100 level course, when we talk about photosynthesis on the exam, for the most part, I want to focus on photosynthesis. So I'm not going to ask you about this, but it's in at least the old textbook, maybe yours, so I'm going to include it. So this incorporation of carbon from the air into organic compounds, such as glucose, and again, to keep things simple, we're just going to focus on glucose. Technically, photosynthesis does create other things, but for us, let's just say it just creates glucose. Anyway, this is called carbon fixation. So obviously, carbon fixation is going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because that's where it's coming from. Obviously, then if we cut down trees, which do this, that's going to reduce the ability of the biosphere, which is basically the entire globe, to absorb carbon. And of course, the opposite of that would be planting new forests because, when you plant forests, they're going to be doing carbon fixation. Any questions about this academically unimportant slide? All right. So now we're almost starting to get into the meat and potatoes when it comes to the exam, which is the light reactions in the Calvin cycle. But even still, you need a little background information. You need a little information about the nature of sunlight and about chloroplast pigments. Then we'll start talking about how that one works and then how Calvin cycle works. This is almost perfect timing because we have 8 minutes left. And then this is the kind of information that you're really going to need to know to truly understand what's happening in today's experiments. So first of all, this is a question you might or might not get. I'm not sure, but sunlight is a type of energy or radiation called electromagnetic energy. You might need to know that. It's just one type of electromagnetic energy. Just like what your cell phone uses, the 5G or whatever kind of phone you have, it uses electromagnetic energy. Your microwaves use electromagnetic energy. When you listen to the radio in your car, if you do that anymore, that uses electromagnetic energy. When you go get X-rays, that's electromagnetic energy. When you get a sunburn from UV light, that is electromagnetic energy. When you're looking at infrared goggles, that's infrared. That is electromagnetic energy. And you see here, light is kind of in the middle. The interesting thing, not that you need to know this, but just for your own knowledge, is not every animal sees things the same. So this is what humans can see. Some animals can see things farther this way. Some animals can see things farther this way. We can see those colors, and some animals can see even more on there, right? We can see it kind of goes from violet to purple to blue to yellow to orange to red. But for some animals, they can see even more distinction in between those colors. Some of them can see even less. Anyway, light acts as waves. That would be important if we were really, if this was a harder class and it wasn't a 100 level class. We were talking about how light acts as waves and its particles. It's a good physics discussion. But we don't even get into it. But the textbook included it, so did I. Technically, light acts as waves. The only reason that's even kind of important, is because then we can talk about something called the wavelength, which is the distance between the crest of two waves, right? Nice and easy. So again, light travels at wavelength. So you can see this, light travels as waves. So you can see that's a wavelength. Now, one thing you're not going to need to know is most of this that's visualized here, you're not going to need to know the wave, like this is the wavelength, right? So this particular color is 580 nanometers long from this wavelength to this wavelength. And the more you get here, there's a shorter wavelength up here and a longer wavelength down there. And you can see there's very specific numbers. I'm not going to test you on that. I will say this, and it might be on the sides anyway. And this is just for your own knowledge. Again, I won't be testing you on this. But when you move this way on the electromagnetic spectrum, you're getting a shorter wavelength, but it's an increased energy. And of course, the opposite is true if you move that. So if you were to get a test question, which I wouldn't ask you, I would say which one's more energetic, violet or red? Violet is more energetic. You can kind of, again, picture a wavelength, right? If I was holding a rope and Noah was holding a rope and I wasn't putting much energy into it, I was doing this, right? You'd have this really big wave, right, with long wavelength. But when I started doing this, right, then the waves would get a lot shorter because I'm putting more energy into it. It's the same thing with light. Anyway, any questions about that side? All right, the next word for attendance will be wave. Or waves, I don't care, plural, singular, whatever. But yeah, that's the next word for attendance. So anyway, you can see now what's energetic. I'm going to go through this part really quickly. So another thing I liked about the old textbook is every chapter, they had like a famous experiment that somebody did done that was relevant to that chapter. So I'm going to really quickly talk about it, but I'm not going to ask you anything about it on the exam. But it also has a lot to do with one of the experiments you're going to be doing today. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. When light shines on a pigment, certain wavelengths are absorbed and disappear, and some are reflected. We've already talked about this before. So this will be very important for whoever ends up doing that last experiment in today's lab. So Noah's shirt is white because the light that's hitting it, all of it's getting reflected. So we're seeing all the colors, which is white. My shirt's jacket here is black because it's mostly absorbing all the colors. So nothing is being reflected back. Not many other, we're kind of all black and white today. It's a class. Well, yours is yellow. Is it yellow, green? Neon green. Yeah. So I wish it was a more natural color. But anyway, his shirt's absorbing all the colors except the one that's being reflected back to us. This is how pigments work. So in the 19th century, botanists discovered that only certain wavelengths are used by plants, or as we're concerned with for this experiment, any photosynthetic organisms. So anyway, you can read all that if you want. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole experiment. I'll just show you basically the results and talk about it very quickly. Yeah, so what they did was they took a white light, they put it through a prism, which turned it into a rainbow, and then they put it on these things that do photosynthesis, right? Like a slide where they have photosynthesis. And they also have bacteria growing there that love oxygen. So they was just looking to see where the bacteria would grow. And this is new to them. This is how part of how we figured all this stuff out. And all the bacteria centered over here, and not much in the middle. And remember, like I said, these bacteria love oxygen, meaning more photosynthesis is happening here and here. Basically, no photosynthesis is happening there. Otherwise, the bacteria would be there. That's a little bit like the experiment you'll be doing today, except we're not going to be looking at the growth of bacteria. We're going to be looking at how pH changes, right? Does it become more acidic because we're adding carbon dioxide to it because it's doing respiration? Or does it become less acidic because we're taking away carbon dioxide because it's doing photosynthesis? But yeah, that experiment that you're doing today is a lot like this thing they did in the 19th century. But again, this idea of, again, pigments. Green is green because that's the one color it's reflecting, which is why it's in theory so bad for photosynthesis, right? Violets is getting absorbed. The reds are getting absorbed. It's that middle spot that's not really getting absorbed. Anyway, you can download the PowerPoint, watch another animation. Just really quickly, less than a minute. Chloroplast pigments. Yeah, this is everything I've already just said, but now there it is again in writing, right? They are green because that is the one color that is being reflected. They are absorbing every color other than green, right? And we know that energy can't be created or destroyed. So what's happening to the electrons? Well, we'll get back to that. That's a good place to stop. So we'll stop a few seconds early. When we come back, we'll get back into talking about chloroplast for more detail. But that's it. No, there is no last word for attendance. Just make sure you send the words I've given you so far. In addition to one question about the material covered, and then we will start lab promptly at 9. So if you need to use the restroom or make a phone call, get a snack, whatever it is you need to do, now's the time to do it. We will start promptly at 9. I'm going to text the TA to make sure he is on his way.